primary thing I believe has changed would be the introduction of contemporary art into curriculums. That simply wasn't done. And for example, in places like the Institute of Fine Arts, you couldn't write a dissertation on an artist who wasn't dead for a century. And suddenly, not only do you have contemporary art, but the primary emphasis in our art history programs now is on the contemporary. That's a radical change in the entire approach to art. Pretty much at every stage, critics like myself and many others were at any moment trying to figure out what the situation was. And I know back in the abstract expressionist days in the 50s, one of the most popular topics that were debated over and over again at the Artists Club was, has the situation changed? When Frank Stella showed those black paintings, my response to them was, if that's art, then anything I believe is art has got to be something else, and vice versa. It was that much of a reaction. And the same thing when Warhol showed his first paintings, and even Lichtenstein, who was I rather more sympathetic to. And at one point I couldn't understand why I was carrying the flag for abstract expressionism, because this art struck me as more and more interesting the more I got into the work of Stella. And in my second book on the New York School, I really treat Stella as the decisive influence in this radical change that takes place around 1959. And it is an absolutely radical change when Stella's work appears. And I couldn't see why I was carrying this flag anymore. And I believe I wrote an article about this around 1965, 6 or 7, I forget the exact date, when I begin to treat this new work, new minimalism pop art, as the art of the 60s, and suggesting that it'll actually replace abstract expressionism because it is the art of its moment, as abstract expressionism was the art of its moment. But you must remember that the art world back in the 50s was very small, really no more than 200 artists. You could get to know them all. I did know them all. And part of my mission as a critic, as I look back, was really to gain recognition for the New York School. So I became the champion of these artists, but even more important, in order to write my early histories, there was very little information. And the only way to generate information was to go to the artists, which I did, and therefore befriended many of them, just looking for what had gone on, back in the 40s and 50s, yes. Sometimes I was lucky. I worked for the Tanager Gallery, which was an artist cooperative from 1956 to 1959. My next door neighbor, if you like, was Willem de Kooning. So I saw him pretty much every day, and he was the artist that we all revered more than any other artist back in the 50s. But then when I was hired to teach art history, it was generally to studio people, both at NYU, adult studio people, and particularly the SUNY Purchase, where my primary classes were composed of artists. And it really wasn't until the popularity of contemporary art, and also the fact that I got a PhD. One of the reasons that I wrote a second memoir was because I didn't deal with it quite as much as I would have liked to or should have in the first memoir. There was a radical change in art and the art world in the early 70s where the modernist agenda really gets played out and art becomes pretty much totally pluralistic. And I wanted to very much deal with that or use that as one of the bases of the new memoir, this change that has taken place. and also the change in the art world, where in 1973 there was an auction, the Skull auction, which raised about $2 million for Mr. Skull. And this was literally the first time that the idea that contemporary art was worth something, really, enough to come up at auction. And that opened up this entire new market. And I'm very much interested in dealing with that in this second memoir of mine, yes, that's Swept Up. Out of the great sympathy I feel, and friendship I feel for Fong Bui, and the idea of that working with him sort of within an art situation rather than within a publishing situation, I found that very attractive, yes. And I think it worked out for me. I thought that my memoir was really more about what was out there and my perception of art and artists out there rather than my own life. Or if I came in, it would have been a response to art, particularly in artists. Mm-hmm. And that is, I find, even more in the second memoir. It's more about what's happening in art as I perceive it, rather than anecdotal material. We took the journal, which had become pretty moribund. It was sort of run by an old guard, and we turned it around by doing thematic issues and also getting very interesting editors to do it. And it's still working more or less that way. There were always new things that were being brought up at College Art Association, where young curators or young historians or young artists would bring their issues. And you could really learn things that you didn't know about your own world at CAA annual meetings. You know, people like myself who stayed very close to what was happening in contemporary art sensed that a change was taking place. And it was not only taking place in contemporary criticism and contemporary writing, but also in art history. Of course, in the essay that I wrote for that journal issue, there were quotes from H.W. Jansen on the situation of modernism and postmodernism, which really were very interesting. Soon after Lucy's presidency, the nature of the organization shifted more to advocacy, more to multiculturalism, to feminism, to African American. And that was a pretty radical change that occurred, but this was after Lucy left the presidency. And I think that that tendency within the organization still continues. There are people who think that the organization should turn more back to academe, to academic subjects, art history, rather than what they think is perhaps too much emphasis on advocacy positions. But it's interesting that this tension does exist in college art and probably should exist. Criticism can be so many different things, from advocacy to I like it, I don't like it, to it's great or not great, to an art historical survey, what are its roots. And it depends very much really on a critic, his or her ability to write well, put ideas across. Sometimes you can really be a quite remarkable stylist, like, say, Peter Sheldall is, or provocative, like, say, David Hickey is, that kind of thing. But I don't think there's any single way that critic can achieve success except by the quality of criticism. I, for example, use criticism to tell me where to go, but I don't know that I should see. And I think that's very much a major function of criticism, particularly today, where artists so much all over the place and so much of it, that if you can trust the taste or the dedication of a critic, that'll help you really to see what you really should be seeing.